Billionaire investor Ray Dalio is sounding the alarm. The U.S. national debt is approaching the point of no return. With the national debt soaring past $36 trillion, the United States is teetering on the edge of a dreaded debt spiral. A dangerous cycle where rising debt leads to skyrocketing interest payments, making the problem even worse. And with inflation looming, history tells us exactly how this story ends. A severe economic depression, according to Ray Dalio. Dalio has studied the downfall of empires, and he sees the warning signs flashing. Here's Dalio to explain. Make sure to stick around till the end of the video because there is a special gift for those who watch the entire video. Let's get into it.
To me, it's almost like the circulatory system. I think that credit is like blood that brings nutrients to all of the parts of the body, and it passes through a system that is like arteries, and then credit creates debt. And the key question, if it's healthy, is does the debt create an income that is more than enough to service the debt? And that's like, I don't know, eating vegetables or something. It's a healthy process. And if not, credit begins to build up this debt. It begins to become like plaque in the arteries. And you can measure it, just like you could measure it in the arteries. And you can see how it constricts that circulatory system. Because as credit and debt service rise, you see that it eats up more and more consumption because you have to spend that. So you could watch the government do that. You can see that how interest is eating up and debt service is eating up, and that means there's less money. And then you also can see how heart attacks take place. And they're very, economic debt heart attacks. And the way they take place is by looking at the supply and the demand. If you have a lot of debt, and then you have a large supply of debt, that has to be bought. Somebody's got to buy it. And so that when you get to the point where there's debt risks, there's not only the new supply that has to be offered, but there is the possibility of holders of those debt assets selling those debt assets. And so the supply becomes overwhelming relative to the demand. And then what that means is it's the same dynamic as it for the government as it is for an individual or a company, except the government can print money. So when that debt service burden rise, or there's a big supply-demand imbalance, if the government, most importantly the central bank, doesn't print money and buy it, then there has to be a rise in the price of the debt to constrict borrowing, and that borrowing constricted, that credit that is not going to come, will weaken the economy and cause bad economic conditions. And so they can let that happen, or they can print money and buy the debt and monetize it. When they do that, that's inflationary, and it lowers the value of the debt. In either case, you don't want to hold that debt because either there's a debt service problem or there's a depreciation. You get paid back with a greater supply and cheaper money. And that is the dynamics, and that's the mechanism. And because it can be measured, it can be seen in all countries, you can watch it happen. And so like you're going to your doctor, you can measure these things, you can see them, and you can know what needs to be done.
Ray Dalio often compares debt cycles to the human circulatory system to illustrate how economies function in a predictable and cyclical manner. Debt is the blood in the economy. Just as blood circulates through the body to deliver oxygen and nutrients, debt circulates in an economy to provide capital and stimulate growth. Borrowing and lending allow businesses and individuals to invest, expand, and consume. Just like blood keeps the body alive and functioning, credit is the energy supply. In the same way that the human body needs a continuous supply of oxygenated blood, economies need a steady flow of credit to remain healthy. When credit flows smoothly, economic activity thrives. The boom and bust cycles in the economy are like blood pressure fluctuations. When there's too much credit pumped into the system, like excessive blood pressure, the economy overheats, leading to economic booms and asset bubbles. On the other hand, when credit contracts too much, it can lead to recessions and depressions, just as low blood pressure can cause fatigue or even failure in the human body. The long-term debt cycle is similar to the aging of the body. Over time, as debts accumulate, similar to the buildup of cholesterol or aging of arteries, the system becomes more fragile. Eventually, a major deleveraging event, akin to a heart attack or medical crisis, may be necessary to restore balance. This is when economies go through major recessions or depressions. The United States has found itself in a very tough spot. As of the making of this video, the U.S. debt is a whopping $36 trillion, a number that is growing with each and every passing second. So how does this even happen in the first place? Just like an individual, a country goes into debt when it spends more money than it takes in. In 2024, the U.S. federal government took in $4.92 trillion in revenue. Almost all of this money was generated through taxes, with individual income taxes, Social Security taxes, and taxes on corporations being the three largest categories by far. Since the government took in $4.92 trillion in taxes, one would logically assume that the government would only be able to spend $4.92 trillion. But that is not the case. The U.S. federal government spent a staggering $6.75 trillion in 2024. The difference between what the government brings in through taxes and what it spends is known as the deficit. This deficit has to be funded through debt. This visual here is a helpful breakdown of government income and spending broken down by category. What's important here is that the United States spent a whopping $882 billion just paying interest on debt. That is more than what the country spent on Medicare, defense, income security, benefits for veterans, education, and transportation. Put another way, 13% of all government spending was to pay interest on debt the country incurred in prior years. This chart here is showing how the U.S. national debt is quickly snowballing out of control. For years, interest on the national debt was steady at relatively consistent levels. That has all changed in the last few years. Annual interest payments on the national debt have more than doubled from where they were as recently as 2021. This is forcing the United States to have to make some very difficult decisions. Listen to Ray Dalio explain.
So what we have is, if I'm speaking to you as the government policymakers, your condition is very bad.
Right.
Okay. You're not in the middle of it now. In other words, we're not seeing that particular dynamic transpire, but you have to change your diet. You have to change your behavior. You have to maybe have a stent put into the equivalent. So you asked about what that is. So number one is, I call it my 3% solution. Here, the solution is you must cut the deficit, which is the equivalent of bonds selling, down to 3% of GDP. And it's 7.5% expected. Now, different people have different views as to how to cut it. Forget it. I don't really care. Just you have to have a unified agreement. Everybody in Congress and the president and so on should pledge to do that. And then the question is how to do it. But they should know that number.
That's about $900 billion a year.
Yeah.
Roughly. And that means cutting it, as you point out, by cutting the deficit by more than half from where it sits.
Yeah,
today.
well, it's yes, because with the continuing the tax cuts, Trump's tax cuts, that'll be 7.5%, and you want to get it down to 3%. And it sounds draconian, but we did that kind of change from 1991 till 1997. And there are 3 keys to this. Do it soon, fast, when the time is good, when the economy's good. In other words, do it now.
Now.
Okay. the temptation is going to say, well, we're going to ease into this and we're going to be there and we're going to do it in 3 years from now. But if you have a bad economy, you cannot do it. Okay. And that's the worst. So we have the best economy, and the sooner you do it, the more you're going to do it. So 3% solution, do it now, and recognize that you have to deliver it. So if you're having, let's say, cost cuts in government, you have to own the number. So everybody's got to pledge 3%. Now, there'd be arguments as to how to get there, but you have to own the number, so much so that you'd say, if it's not 3%, throw me out of office because I've got to deliver that number. So if government cost expense cutting, is it really the $2 trillion number? Is it the $1 trillion number? Is it a $500 billion number?
Right.
We all throw those numbers around. You got to own the number, and you got to get to 3. And you can't make it any one thing.
Right.
But you also have to realize, like, if you did it spread out, nothing's going to be that big. So, nothing's going to be insurmountable. So the important thing is 3%. The other thing about it is to realize that if you make those moves, the bond market it will benefit. You see this, and so interest
rates will go down.
Right, and interest rates going down, interest rate expense is most important.
In 2024, the United States had a federal deficit of $1.8 trillion. At the same time, the size of the U.S. economy, as measured by GDP, is $29.2 trillion. This means that the federal deficit as a percentage of GDP is 6.2%. Ray Dalio says that in order for the United States to avoid the worst possible outcome, that number needs to come down to 3% as quickly as possible. Put another way, that means the deficit would have to fall by more than half, from $1.8 trillion down to closer to $850 billion. At the end of the day, there are only 2 things the U.S. can do to lower the federal deficit. The first is to increase the amount of money the federal government takes in each year. This would mean substantially higher taxes. The other option is to cut spending. Cutting spending would mean potentially cutting programs related to social services, healthcare, education, and defense. Both of these options are incredibly unpopular and would be painful for a large portion of U.S. citizens, at least in the short or medium term. However, if the United States is able to make these tough decisions, Dalio believes the benefit would come in 2 forms. The first one is obvious. By reducing the federal deficit, the national debt will stop growing as quickly. If the economy continues to grow, the economy may one day even be able to, quote, grow into this large amount of debt. You see, a country having debt is not inherently a bad thing. It starts to become challenging when the debt is too large relative to the size of the country. The second benefit is less obvious. Ray Dalio believes that if the U.S. is able to reduce the federal deficit, the interest rate for the government to borrow money will also decline. This would help stop the U.S. from entering into the dreaded debt spiral. Let me explain. Take a look at this chart here. Interest rates on government debt are determined by the principle of supply and demand. This line here represents the supply of money available for the government to borrow. Think of this as how much money investors across the world are willing to lend to the U.S. government. This line here represents the demand for that money from the United States. Essentially, how much money the U.S. government needs to borrow during any time period. The point at which these lines cross is the interest rate the United States has to pay to borrow money. If the United States is able to reduce the deficit, the country will appear to borrow less money to fill the gap in its budget. Back to our earlier example, if the government spends less money while also taking more money in, that difference, known as the deficit, gets smaller and smaller. Back to our supply and demand graph, this would have the effect of pushing the demand line to the left as the government needs to borrow less money. Notice how now the point at which the 2 lines cross is at a lower interest rate. This may not seem important, but is actually crucial for the U.S. being able to solve its debt problem. With a national debt of $36 trillion, every 1 percentage point reduction in the interest rate for the government to borrow money would fall by a staggering $360 billion. Here's how this could radically improve the finances of the United States. If the U.S. is able to cut the federal deficit to 3% of GDP through cost cuts and revenue increases, That would take the deficit from $1.8 trillion down to roughly $850 billion. Let's say for the sake of argument that Dalio is correct and interest rates come down as a result by 2 percentage points. That would be $720 billion in annual interest savings. This would reduce the deficit to about $100 billion, or just a measly 0.3% of the country's GDP. Ultimately, only time will tell how things play out for the United States. However, according to Ray Dalio, the U.S. must act quickly to avoid the worst possible outcome. This really is a race against time as the national debt continues to grow with each passing second. As promised, and as a thank you for watching this video, I have a special treat for you. Get exclusive access to Charlie Munger's 11 mental models to outperform the market, completely free and available only through the link in the video description. I dedicated hours to creating this document, and you won't find this kind of information for free anywhere else online. Studying Charlie Munger's mental models has had a profound impact on my life, and I'm confident it can do the same for you. Don't miss out. Download it now and start learning. Enjoy! Additionally, if you have made it this far in the video, it is obvious you are serious about learning about investing, the economy, and how to make money. If that is the case, make sure to check out this video here as legendary investor Warren Buffett shares his thoughts on the storm that is brewing within the real estate market. With over 6 million views, Buffett's comments have definitely been getting people's attention. I will see you over there.